Hey everyone, welcome to Station 2. So, as we've been reading your writing, we've been noticing a lot of errors in how you use commas, and so today we're going to go over how to distinguish between independent clauses and dependent clauses, because that's going to tie into how we use commas. Okay, first, an independent clause is a group of words that has a subject and a verb. So it's a sentence that expresses a complete thought. It's also a clause that don't need a man to support it. Okay, so some examples are that a sentence that says she waited. So in this case, she is the subject and waited is a verb. Okay, so that's a complete thought. The second example says he ran quickly. Okay, so he is the subject, ran is the verb, and quickly in this case is an adverb. It just describes how he ran. On the other hand, a dependent clause is a group of words that contains a subject and a verb, but it doesn't express a complete thought. So it relies on having an independent clause in order for it to make sense. So some examples are when Ronnie gets here, if Denise comes to class late, or which I bought last weekend. Okay, so all of these dependent clauses would rely on a second independent sentence in order for it to make sense. So for example, when Ronnie gets here, he is going to get a tardy slip. Or if Denise comes to class late, she will get another detention. Okay, so she will get another detention is a complete sentence, an independent clause. One way to distinguish whether you need a comma after a dependent clause is if you see some of these dependent marker words. Okay, so examples are like after, although, as if, even though, in order to. So most likely if it comes at the beginning of a sentence, you're going to need a comma after this clause. So even though she was late, she did her homework. So you would need a comma after even though she was late. Another example in the sentence, because it is raining, comma, we have an umbrella. So because it is raining is a dependent clause that relies on the second sentence, we have an umbrella, for it to make sense. Whereas we have an umbrella is a complete sentence, and even if we had crossed out this particular phrase, it would still make sense on its own. On the other hand, we can also write it as an independent clause without any commas and without a dependent clause. So for example, we have an umbrella because it is raining. Okay, and the reason why it's important to understand independent and dependent clauses is because it really ties into how we use commas. And there's like a million rules for commas, so I understand that it gets really complicated and overwhelming, but again, we want to just make sure that we use commas as properly as possible, as much as possible. So a lot of you guys are familiar with rule number 1, which is using a comma to separate items in a series. So for example, the teacher passed out the quiz, comma, sat down on her chair, comma, and stared at the students. Notice how the sentence also uses what's called parallel structure, so that all the verbs and the nouns are pretty much structured in the same way. So passed out, she sat down, and she stared at. Okay, so all these verbs are in past tense, and it has commas to separate all the items and activities that she did. You would also use a comma before what's called a coordinating conjunction. So a lot of you guys are familiar with fanboys. It just stands for and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. So these are conjunctions that connect two independent clauses or two independent sentences. So for example, you can go to a movie with me, comma, or you can go shopping alone. So notice even if we took out the comma and the or, these sentences would still make sense on their own. So you can go to a movie with me, I could have put a period here, and I could have also said, or you can go shopping alone. Okay, and that would also be a complete sentence. As we said, we can also use a comma after a dependent marker. So dependent markers are words like after, although, as, while, when, until, before, because, if, and since. Okay, notice that a dependent marker is not being that. I've noticed you guys use that phrase a lot in your writing, but being that is not a real academic phrase. For some reason, you guys just like to use it a lot. If you ever catch yourself saying being that, just replace it with since or if. Okay, so if the football team wants to win a trophy, they will have to practice every day. Okay, so the dependent clause is here, so if the football team wants to win the trophy, and the independent sentence is here, so they will have to practice every day. Okay, again, if we took out the dependent clause, the second sentence here would still make sense. Number 4, we also want to use a comma to set off any clauses that are not necessarily essential to the meaning of the sentence. So anything that we could take out and the sentence would still make sense. So for example, my grandfather, who is 90 years old, so again, that's just giving us extra information, but it's not absolutely essential. Okay, if we took it out, it would still make sense. My grandfather has his own social media accounts, but by providing this extra information, okay, it adds meaning to the sentence. So we will also use commas around those. Another way that we use commas is set up what's called an appositive. So an appositive is a noun or a noun phrase that basically describes the noun that's beside it. So for example, my uncle's car, a red Lamborghini, so this is the appositive, it's describing what kind of car my uncle has. My uncle's car always gets attention on the road. So notice there's a comma there to set it off. And again, this is not essential information, so we could easily take it out of the sentence and it would still make sense. So my uncle's car always gets attention on the road. Okay, we also use commas to separate two adjectives when we use it in a sentence. In this example, the man lived a long, happy life. Okay, so there will be a comma in between the two adjectives that we use. When we introduce quotes, we also want to use commas. So in this case, Shakespeare writes, comma, all the world's a stage in as you like it. Note that if you're integrating or blending in your quotes with your own writing, you don't necessarily need to use commas. Okay, another rule is that we use commas around or after interjections, so basically words that disrupt a sentence. So for example, this word, unfortunately, we would need a comma, I couldn't go to the party. Alright, and then finally, commas also go between dependent and independent clauses. So if we have an independent clause followed by a dependent clause, it would look like this. So Kai rode her bike to school, wondering if she would get there on time. Okay, so this dependent clause here, wondering if she would get there on time, is kind of modifying or describing how Kai rode her bike. She was riding her bike and she was thinking about whether or not she would get to school on time. Another example is if you use a comma between a dependent clause and an independent clause, kind of going back to rule number 3 right here. Okay, so by starting with the dependent clause, when Bradley won the game, followed by a independent clause, he celebrated at TGI Fridays. So notice he celebrated at TGI Fridays would still make sense on its own. Okay, and the error that we by far see the most in your writing are what's called comma splices. So commas cannot be used to connect two independent clauses or two complete sentences. So this is called a comma splice, and it drives me insane whenever you guys do it. So please stop doing it. So an example of a comma splice is, my family bakes together nearly every night, comma. We then get to enjoy everything we make together. Okay, so this is how we don't use a comma. There are two complete sentences here. We do not need a comma here. Okay, there are two ways that you could easily correct this. So you can use a period to separate it into two sentences on its own. So my family bakes together nearly every night, period. Capital W, we then get to enjoy everything we make together. Okay, so we do not need a comma there. Another way we could correct it is to add a comma, but to also add a conjunction. So for example, my family bakes together nearly every night, comma, and we then get to enjoy everything we make together. Alright, if you really want to get fancy, okay, you can also use a semicolon. But please, again, make sure that you're using a semicolon only if it's between two complete sentences. So my family bakes together nearly every night, semicolon. We then get to enjoy everything we make together. Okay, and again, these ideas are connected, so it makes sense for us to use a semicolon here. Alright, now that we've gone over this, we're going to do a little bit of practice. So you should have received some small manila envelopes, and in each envelope, if you dump it out, you'll see some color-coded sentences, sentence strips, and some commas. So all the color-coded ones kind of go together, so all the blue strips are one sentence, all the pink strips are one sentence, and so on. So on the front of your envelope, you're going to find a list of an order. It kind of goes from easiest to hardest. So I would suggest going to working in that order. You're going to basically just unscramble the phrases in order to form a coherent sentence. And you're going to use the commas that are given to you to place them in a way that makes sense. Okay, and I've given you more commas than you actually need. Okay, so just be mindful. Sometimes it helps me when I read it out loud and try to see where the commas would go. So when you're done, you can get an answer key from my desk to check your answers.